When we use the expression worship, most Christians think of something they do on a Sunday in a church with a large group of people, somebody playing a piano perhaps, leading singing, maybe it's a band, maybe it's an organ, and people are singing, and they think of that as worship. And the Bible can connect that with worship, but it actually doesn't ever say that anywhere in the New Testament. To me, it's one of the most shocking things that hardly anybody ever talks about. They have all this teaching and ideas about what worship is in churches, but the Bible never talks about the church worshiping. Do you ever notice that? Now, part of the reason for that is I really think worship is largely individual. It's what you are doing in connection with God. And you can't get everybody in a church or in a group all on the same page, all thinking really clearly or accurately about God. It's largely about how I'm feeling about myself a lot of times. And I've listened to people, I've even listened to people say this about responding to worship, that it's like, I like that song, it really makes me feel good. And yet worship really is about focusing on the character of God. We're going to take a look at some of Paul's closing instructions to the Colossians, and one of these is going to include an instruction about worship. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. We're surveying through the New Testament. We're really coming close to a concluding here in Colossians, and Paul says, persevere in prayer. This is the way William Mounce translates this. And most of your Bibles are going to translate this word pursuke and pursukamai, prayer. It's an interesting term because it's a term that in the Greek world was used only of a communication towards God. A lot of the other words that are used for talking to God are used of communication between people, but not pursuke and pursukamai. Well, I haven't looked at all these documents. I'm just looking at word study books that talk about these things because I haven't pored over all the material that is available to us from ancient Greek culture, just letting you know. But this is what they notice, is that this is a term that was used for communication to a God. And it always focused on the character of God. In other words, the Greeks looked at the fact that if I want to ask God for something, I need to, shall we say, for lack of a better way, stroke his ego first. You are such a great God. You are so powerful. You are so fill in the blank. This is not what you and I do. We do not stroke the ego of God and then ask for things. We talk to God, not because God needs to be reminded, not because he needs his ego stroked, but because you and we need to remember who God is. I'm going to go talk to God about, I've got a need. This person has a need, and I want to talk to God about that. And sometimes my whole thinking about that need and about what God might do is changed as I think about the character of God. And I'm thinking, yeah, this is who you are. And therefore, I'm not going to ask for this thing that maybe I might be inclined to ask for. I'm going to ask for this because this is consistent with who you are. Paul says here in verse 2, it says this word that he translates persevere. It's a word literally hold fast in is kind of another way of looking at this word. Hold fast in prayer. And I would suggest, and we've done this before, and I'm not going to go through and prove it today, but I believe that this is the word that kind of takes over for what we would have considered worship. Because the Old Testament worship really emphasized physical posture in a physical place with a recitation of something about God. And Jesus says in John 4 that all changes because now we're going to worship God in spirit and in truth, genuine. It's going to be genuine worship. You could go as an Old Testament person, you could go through the motions of worship, but it's not genuine. Now God only looks at what we do. Is it genuine? Are we really seriously thinking about who God is? So he says, hold fast then in these prayers or this worship. In other words, Again, the New Testament Christians, like the Greeks, do not think of this term as primarily an asking term. It's a term that encompasses all of the asking. And so asking a lot of times appears to be in this word, though it's always that I'm talking to God about who God is, and it's in that context I ask. And there's a number of passages that do that. And as I said, I'm not going to go through and demonstrate that today. But he says, you guys need to be doing this, watching in it, paying attention, watching. Why? Because they've had the problem of these false teachers. And if you're paying attention to who God is, it's going to go a long way in helping you pay attention to watch out for, shall we say, these false teachers. Mount says vigilant here, not a bad way of maybe thinking about this idea of paying attention here. And you do so with thanksgiving. Again, the false teachers don't want you to focus on the character of God and give God thanks, but we know we should. We should always give thanks, as Paul told the Thessalonians. And he actually even told us this just back in chapter 3, and I think it's verse 17 or 18 here of this passage, that whatever you do, do it giving thanks. So he says, you need to be those that are giving thanks. And then he says in verse 3, and at the same time, or literally all together, so at the same time, all together. Again, this is not a reference to a corporate worship service, but rather that while you're focusing on this, you really need to be those who are also praying or worshiping. This is around us. In other words, as you're thinking about the character of God, you do it around us and our need and our circumstances. And that happens. I don't mean to embarrass my wife. I appreciate this, but it's one of the things I really like listening to my wife pray, because when she's thinking about a person's need, she really comes to thinking about, who is God in this? Who are you, God, in this thing? And she thinks about the character of God around this person's need. And I hear her do this so many times, and it really encourages me. And that's really what Paul is saying here. At the same time, you worship not for us. He's not saying ask for us. He's saying you're worshiping around our need, around the situation, that God might open for us a door to speak the word, the mystery of the Christ. Now, the mystery of the Christ is, as we've talked about in here, that Jesus Christ is the head, and he shares some of his identity with all of us. And so he says, I need to make this known. Paul actually says at the end of this, I'm bound for this. I'm in bonds, or I am chained. He's in a Roman imprisonment. Why? Because Paul, when he went to Jerusalem in Acts 21, needed to tell these people about this, and it was a hard thing to communicate to them because they still wanted to make a difference between the believers who were Jewish and the believers who were from the nations. And the mystery of the Christ is that we are all one. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 6, we all are equal heirs. We all are equal parts of the body, and we all are equal partakers of the promise, and that promise is of access. And we've been over that before. And he says, I really want you, as you're thinking about God, I want you to come around me. I want you to then to obviously ask God for me, that I might make this known, in order that I might make it known, make it visible, make it plainly known to people, as it is necessary for me to speak. So, talking here about the need of communicating to God, thinking about how we relate to other people, should, as a believer, involve our focusing on the character of God. Not just running immediately, hey, God, so-and-so has a need, fix that need. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but boy, I tell you, you go through the New Testament and you find how many times Paul uses this language of this prayer, as we call it. Paul and the other writers look at it as focusing on the character of God and then moving to maybe a need or request. And a lot of times that word is followed by supplicating or asking. In other words, they do this and they do this. They're actually doing two things. Now, not every passage does that. Sometimes it's just indicated by the language that's used there without actually using those specific words. This is the way as believers that we need to learn to talk. Worship really is a lot less about a worship service at church, something that was introduced in time, not introduced in the New Testament. And I think we've done this before. If you go to 1 Corinthians 14 and you look at that, it doesn't look anything like our church services today. It's one where a lot of different people are participating in. They're getting up and they're sharing things on behalf of everybody else. We get in there and we sing, and then a man gets up and speaks for, hopefully a good time, a good length of time to really teach us the Word of God. And then maybe we sing again and everybody goes home. And that was not the way the early church operated. And I think it's something where we need to seriously think about how we do church today too. But having said all of that, the importance of worship in church, but mostly in this verse, in your daily activity, your daily relationship with God, thinking about other believers. So I encourage you, worship God. Think about the character of God. When you're talking to Him about other people and their needs, don't forget to bring God into the picture. You're talking to Him, but don't forget to think about who He is and to think about His character. As always, I want to thank you for joining me and encourage you to be a person that learns to really think about the character of God when you're talking to Him, about people, yourself, whatever it might be. Have a great day in the Lord.